In 2002, a man named Matias Reyes was sitting in a prison in upstate New York, serving time for a series of rapes and a murder he had committed in 1989 and 1990. He had been there for years. He was not going anywhere. One day he asked to speak to a lawyer. He had something he wanted to say. He wanted to say that in April 1989 he had attacked a woman jogging alone in Central Park. He had done it by himself. He had not been part of a group. He described details of the assault that only the person who had committed it could have known. When investigators ran his DNA against the evidence preserved from the crime scene, it matched. At the time Reyes came forward, a man named Corey Wise was in the same prison. Corey Wise had been sent there 13 years earlier when he was 16 years old. He had been convicted of the crime that Reyes had just confessed to committing. Wise was not the only one. 4 other young men, Raymond Santana, Kevin Richardson, Antron McCrae, and Yusuf Salam had also been convicted. They had been 14, 15, and 16 years old when they were arrested. They had served between 6 and 13 years in prison. They had spent those years saying they were innocent. They had been saying it since the night they were interrogated, and no one with the power to act on it had believed them. Here is what the evidence against them had consisted of their confessions. That was it. No DNA connected them to the crime. No eyewitness placed them near Tricia Maley when she was attacked. No physical evidence of any kind linked them to her. Only the confessions taken over the course of more than 24 hours of interrogation, without food, without sleep, without attorneys with detectives telling each teenager separately that the others had already admitted everything and that cooperation was the only way out. The confessions contradicted each other on basic facts: the location of the attack, the sequence of events, who did what and when. The inconsistencies were pointed out at trial. The jury convicted anyway. This is not at its core a story about 5 teenagers and a crime they did not commit. It is a story about a city, about what a city becomes when it has been frightened for long enough, about the particular kind of judgment that fear produces, the kind that moves fast and feels certain and does not ask the questions that a slower, less frightened mind would ask. About what it costs when a city decides it needs an answer badly enough to accept one that isn't true. To understand what happened in April 1989, you have to understand what New York City was in April 1989. It was a city in the middle of the worst decade in its modern history. The crack epidemic had arrived in the mid-1980s and had restructured the underground economy of entire neighborhoods, Harlem, the South Bronx, Bed-Stuy, in ways that produced a specific and relentless violence. The murder rate had been climbing for years. In 1990, the year after the Central Park attack, New York City recorded 2,245 homicides. That is more than 6 people killed every single day for an entire year. People who lived through that period describe a particular quality of the city's atmosphere, not just fear, which is too simple a word, but something more chronic and more corrosive. The sense that the city was not under control, that the institutions meant to maintain order were overwhelmed. That public space, including Central Park, had become something you navigated carefully and avoided in certain hours and in certain ways. The wealthy were leaving. The middle class was leaving. Neighborhoods that had been mixed were sorting themselves by race and income in ways that reflected and reinforced the fear. The city was rating itself in its own press and in its own conversation as a place in crisis, as evidence that something had broken down in the social order and had not been fixed. Central Park sat at the center of all of this, not just geographically, but symbolically. It was the park in the middle of the city, the place that was supposed to belong to everyone, that was supposed to represent the city's capacity to share public space across its many divides. And it had become, in the popular imagination of 1989, a place where that belonging was conditional, where you ran in the morning but not at night, where you knew which paths were safer, where the city's violence, which was elsewhere an abstraction, felt close. When Tricia Mailey was attacked on the night of April 19th and found unconscious with a fractured skull on a path in Central Park, the story landed in a city that had been waiting for exactly this kind of event, not wanting it, not welcoming it, but in some terrible way prepared for it. The fear had been building toward a moment, and this was the moment. The city needed to understand what had happened. More than that, the city needed to believe it could be explained. The 5 boys in the park that night were not there to attack anyone. They came from Harlem. Raymond Santana was 14. Kevin Richardson was 14. Antron McCrae was 15. Yusef Salam was 15. Corey Wise was 16 and had come to the park not with the group originally, but to find his friend Yusef. He had a hearing difficulty and communication had always been harder for him, and going to find his friend was the kind of thing friends did. They were part of a larger group that night, somewhere between 20 and 30 young people who had come to the park in the loosely organized way that teenagers come to places in cities, drawn by the pull of other teenagers and the warmth of an April evening. The group had behaved badly in various ways over the course of the night. They had taken food from a man, they had harassed cyclists, they had gotten into a confrontation with a jogger who was not Tricia Mailey. They were not innocent of everything that happened in that park that night. They were innocent of what they were charged with. When police began making arrests in the park in the early hours of April 20th, Santana and Richardson were picked up. They were brought to a precinct. They were questioned. Over the course of the following hours, the others were brought in too, including Wise, who had not been in the park when arrests began, but was found nearby. By the time the interrogations were over, and they went on for a long time, the exact duration disputed but measured in tens of hours, for several of the boys, 4 of the 5 had signed written confessions, and 3 had given videotaped statements. The statements were recorded only at the end of the interrogation process. The cameras came on when the confession was already in place, when the boy in the chair had already been brought to the point of saying what the detectives needed him to say. The hours before the cameras turned on the long hours of questions and pressure, and the specific technique that New York law permitted at the time, which allowed detectives to lie to suspects, including minors, about what the other suspects had said, those hours were not recorded. They happened in rooms with no documentation except the memory of the people in them. What the boys described afterward was a particular kind of wearing down. Not dramatic violence, nothing like what the Burge victims had described in Chicago. Something quieter and in some ways harder to explain to a jury. The detective who tells a 14-year-old that his friend has already given him up, and that if he just confirms what they already know, he can go home. The same question asked again in different forms over many hours until the shape of the answer the detective wants becomes clearer than the shape of what actually happened. The hunger and the exhaustion and the absence of anyone who loves you in a building full of people whose job is to get you to say something. Each boy in a separate room was told that the others had already confessed. This was a lie told to each of them simultaneously. The lie was legal. Under New York law in 1989, detectives were permitted to deceive suspects during interrogation. They were permitted to deceive minors. There was no requirement that parents be present, no requirement that the process be recorded from the beginning, no requirement that the child in the chair be told what rights he had before the questioning began. Yusef Salam's mother arrived at the precinct during the interrogation and asked to see her son. She was told she could not. She was told she would need to wait. She waited in the building while in a room she could not enter. Her 15-year-old son was being questioned about a rape he had not committed by men who were telling him his friends had already said he did it. The confessions, when they came, did not fit together. The boys described different sequences of events, different locations, different roles for themselves and the others. Prosecutors would later argue that the inconsistencies reflected the disorganized reality of a group assault. Defense attorneys argued that they reflected the fact that the boys were describing something they had not seen and were making it up under pressure, each constructing a version that matched what they had been told, and that might be believed and might get them out of the room. No DNA from any of the five was found at the scene. No eyewitness placed any of the five with Tricia May Lee. The only evidence was the confessions. The confessions were enough. The city had already decided before the trials began. The day after the arrest, the word appeared in headlines across New York: wilding, a term one of the boys had used to describe the group's activity in the park, meaning in his usage just going around causing trouble in a general sense, was stripped of that context and made to mean something specific and terrifying. It became the headline word, the word that organized the story the city was telling itself. A wolf pack, the tabloids said. Predators, monsters. The Daily News ran a front page. The Post ran a front page. The language did not pause to ask whether the boys had done what they were accused of. The language was performing the city's fear back to the city in the most concentrated form available. Donald Trump, 2 weeks after the arrests, before a single day of trial, before a single piece of evidence had been presented in any courtroom, purchased full-page advertisements in 4 New York City newspapers. The headline read, "Bring back the death penalty. Bring back our police." The text said, "I want to hate these muggers and murderers. They should be forced to suffer, and when they kill, they should be executed for their crimes." He was a real estate developer at the time. He spent $85,000 on the advertisements. The boys had not been convicted of anything. They had not been tried. The word murderers appeared in a paid advertisement calling for their execution in papers that hundreds of thousands of people read over their morning coffee. 12 days after 5 teenagers had been arrested on the basis of confessions that contradicted each other and contained no physical corroboration. Yusef Salam said later it gave way to a lot of other voices that came forward and said hang Corey from a tree in Central Park. Take the others and horsewhip them. He was 15 years old when those voices arrived. Corey Wise was 16. The city was not being manipulated into a reaction it would not otherwise have had. The advertisement landed in soil that was prepared for it. The fear was real. The exhaustion with violence was real. The desire for the thing to be explained and resolved and punished was real. What the advertisement did was not create those feelings, but give them a specific and immediate target before the evidence had been tested, before the process that was supposed to separate guilt from innocence had run. The trials, when they came in 1990, were not meaningless proceedings. Evidence was presented. Defense attorneys challenged the confessions, pointed to the inconsistencies, noted the absence of physical evidence. A forensic expert testified that the DNA found at the scene did not match any of the 5 defendants. The jury heard all of it. The jury convicted. One juror interviewed afterward said she believed the confessions because she could not understand why anyone would confess to something they had not done. That is the question at the center of this story. Not why Matias Reyes waited 13 years to tell the truth. Not why the police interrogated teenagers for 30 hours without recording the sessions. Those questions have answers, however uncomfortable. The question that matters is the one the juror asked. Why would someone confess to something they didn't do? Because the answer to that question that people confess to things they did not do when they are young and frightened and isolated and told that everyone else has already given them up and that the only way out is through was an answer the city of New York in 1990 did not want to sit with. Because sitting with it required asking what that said about the process that had produced the confessions, about the detectives, about the hours before the cameras turned on, about the city's need to have this resolved quickly and definitively in a way that fit the story the fear had already written. Corey Wise went into prison at 16. He came out at 29. He was the only one of the 5 tried as an adult, because at 16 he was old enough under New York law at the time. The others tried as juveniles served 6 to 7 years. Wise served 13. He was in an adult facility from the beginning. A teenager among adults in the general population for over a decade. In prison he learned to read. He had come in barely literate, the hearing difficulties having made formal schooling difficult his whole life, and he taught himself in the years he was locked up. He drew, he wrote. He did what a person does when a cell is the world, and there is nothing to do but be in it. When Matias Reyes came forward in 2002, he explained his decision partly in terms of Corey Wise. He and Wise had been in the same facility. He had come to know who Wise was. He had come to understand that Wise was still in prison, had never been released, had still been there all these years for something Reyes himself had done. That realization, according to Reyes, was what moved him. Wise was standing in the yard. Reyes was in the yard. 2 men in the same institution, one of whom had committed the crime that had put the other there. 13 years after Central Park. It came to this: a serial rapist and murderer looking across a prison yard at a man who had lost his entire young adulthood to a confession extracted under duress and deciding finally to say something. The convictions of all 5 were vacated on December 19, 2002. What happened after the vacatur tells you something about the city. The New York Police Department did not acknowledge error. A spokesperson in the days following the vacatur suggested that the 5 might have been involved in the attack, alongside Reyes might have participated in some way that the evidence had not captured. There was no basis for this suggestion. There was no DNA, no eyewitness, no physical evidence of any kind. The suggestion was made anyway because the alternative, acknowledging that 5 teenagers had spent decades in prison for a crime they did not commit based on confessions extracted in the manner described, required a different kind of accounting than the department was prepared to offer. Linda Fairstein, who had been the head of the Manhattan DA's sex crimes unit at the time of the prosecution and who had supervised the case, maintained for years afterward that the 5 had been guilty of something that night, that the prosecution had been appropriate, that the system had worked. She did not change her public position after the vacatur. She maintained it for decades. In 2019, following the release of a Netflix miniseries about the case, the backlash against her position was severe enough that her publisher dropped her. She had written crime novels for years, using her prosecutorial background as her credential. The credential, it turned out, was more complicated than the book jackets had suggested. In 2014, the city of New York settled a civil lawsuit brought by the 5 men for $41 million. The settlement was accompanied by a statement that the city was not admitting wrongdoing. $41 million. No wrongdoing admitted. The mathematics of that settlement, the willingness to pay the money but not say the words, reflects something specific about the city's relationship to what it had done. The money acknowledged in the language of settlement that something had gone wrong. The denial of wrongdoing preserved the city's ability to tell itself that whatever had gone wrong was not in any accountable sense the city's fault. I want to be careful about how I describe what happened in New York in 1989, because the easy version of this story, the city was racist, the police were corrupt, the system failed, is true but not complete. The city was frightened. That is the more complete truth. The fear was not invented, and it was not irrational. People were dying at a rate that is almost incomprehensible now. The violence was real, and it was close, and it touched the lives of people across the city, not just in the neighborhoods where it was most concentrated. The desire for it to stop and for someone to be held accountable, and for the explanation to be simple, and the resolution to be quick, that desire was human and understandable. What the fear did was to create the conditions under which a certain kind of mistake becomes possible. The kind of mistake where you see something that fits the story you need, and you stop asking whether it fits the facts. Where the confession that contradicts itself is explained away rather than questioned. Where the absence of physical evidence is treated as a detail rather than a problem. Where 5 teenagers saying "I didn't do it" is heard as the kind of thing that guilty people say. Fear does not make people evil, it makes them certain. And certainty in a criminal proceeding is more dangerous than malice, because certainty is harder to dislodge. The people who convicted those 5 boys were in most cases not doing what they were doing out of hatred. They were doing it out of the conviction that they had the right answer, that the confessions were real, that the boys were guilty, that the city's long nightmare had in this case been given a face and a name, and that something could finally be done. The certainty was wrong. The certainty cost 5 people, collectively, more than 40 years of their lives. Raymond Santana, Kevin Richardson, Antron McCray, Yusef Salaam, and Corey Wise are known today as the Exonerated 5. They have spoken publicly extensively about what was done to them. They have advocated for reform of interrogation laws. New York has since passed legislation limiting deceptive interrogation tactics, particularly with minors, driven in part by their case. Yusef Salaam was elected to the New York City Council in 2023, representing Harlem. Corey Wise established the Corey Wise Innocence Project at the University of Colorado, using the money from the civil settlement to fund work on wrongful convictions. He was 29 years old when he left prison. He had gone in at 16. He has spent the years since doing what he can with what he has. Matias Reyes is still in prison. He received no additional sentence for the Central Park assault because the statute of limitations had expired. He confessed to something he could not be punished for, which means the confession was in its way an act of something. Not quite redemption, that word carries more than the act can hold. But something. Central Park is different now. The city is different. The murder rate dropped through the 1990s and has not returned to what it was. The fear that defined 1989 has not disappeared, but it has changed shape, as fear does when the conditions that produced it change. What has not changed is the fact of those 40 years. The years Corey Wise spent in a cell teaching himself to read. The years the others spent navigating what prison does to young men. The families who visited and waited and carried the weight that the families of the wrongfully convicted carry, the knowledge that something is wrong and the inability to make anyone with power believe it. The city settled for $41 million and admitted no wrongdoing. The fear that made it possible has not been settled at all. It lives in the machinery of the city, in the way investigations are conducted when pressure is high and time is short, and the need for an answer outpaces the caution that finding the right answer requires. 5 boys went into Central Park on an April evening in 1989 and came out in handcuffs, and the city closed around them like a hand that was certain it had caught the thing it was looking for. It had caught the wrong thing, and the certainty that made that possible, the certainty that fear produces, the certainty that stops asking questions because it already has an answer, is not a thing that a $41 million settlement puts to rest. It is still there, waiting for the next time the city gets frightened enough to need a story more than it needs the truth.